sandwiched between two famous kings, his father John and his son Edward. He is the forgotten ruler of the 13th century. His reign was long and not beaten until George III. So, follow me as we explore the tumultuous reign of Henry III. Let's get stuck in. The Christmas court in the year 1229 was spent once again at York, and no doubt in the Bailey court, as the keep itself wouldn't be fit for purpose, given it was wrecked 2 years ago in a powerful storm, no doubt still suffering damage. And remember, this isn't a stone castle, it's a wooden affair built during the reign of William the Conqueror. And the king would not be alone. He no doubt had been accompanied by Hubert de Burgh and his most closest magnates. There would have been Walter de Grey, the Archbishop of York. And we know through Wendover that the King of Scotland, Alexander II, was also present in York. He was at his court. Relations between the two kingdoms were good. And given the chaos of the military muster at Portsmouth, King Henry, only in his early 20s, no doubt welcomed the peace. Hubert de Burgh, who although was still on the naughty step, had one more chance. Another muster was planned in the spring. Though elsewhere in the kingdom there was an event that the king must have seen as an omen, as the new year brought another powerful storm. According to Roger of Wendover, the Benedictine monk and chronicler contemporary to this time, there's a church service going on at St Paul's Cathedral in London on the 25th of January 1230, the feast of the conversion of St Paul, a joyous occasion. So picture this, as explained by Wendover. Roger Niger, the Bishop of London, is standing at the high altar conducting the service. A great multitude of people had gathered in the building, and all was going well. Then the weather changes. The air gets dense. The sun vanishes behind the clouds. The church all goes dark, and brother could not recognise brother. Which makes sense, as there's no electricity, and at this time of day you wouldn't be lighting candles. Those big windows are illuminating the place with a nice ambience, assuming the sun was out. And now the sky is turned black, plunging the place into darkness. Suddenly, describes Wendover, there was a terrible rumble of thunder and a flash of lightning. The church tower was overwhelmed, and there was a foul stench. So, Roger Niger leads the congregation out of peril of the damaged church and into the streets. He leaves a bishop and a deacon at the cathedral to oversee things. Okay, Roger here, this is Wendover, not Niger, appears to be explaining that St Paul's Cathedral was struck by lightning in 1230. Yes, not the best of omens, and quite considerable damage, if the chronicler is anything to go by. Naturally, I cannot find any source of this online. But this is why I don't use online sources, as they have rudimentary information at best. And I'm not dismissing our reliable monk. We can trust his other information, so I believe we can trust this. Oh, and I should say monks, plural, as the Flores Historiarum has several versions, and I'm using the second version, the one compiled by Matthew Paris. Another, a Benedictine monk, who also lived at St Albans Abbey alongside Wendover. They knew each other, they were friends. And Paris does add his own parts now and then, often editing Wendover. Yes, it's a long story, right? Anyway, talking of the church in general, elsewhere you have the ongoing feud with Pope Gregory and Frederick of the Holy Roman Empire. Well, they finally agree to put their differences aside, bringing an end to the rift that was damaging to both the Empire and the Church. And there is also the aftermath of Hubert's folly from a couple of years ago. Remember, in 1228, when de Burgh stupidly provoked a war with the Welsh and got embroiled in an unwinnable conflict with Llywelyn the Great of North Wales. Well, there's more to it than that. It's going to get concluded, as the Welsh prince had captured William de Braows, not the famous rebel in the era of King John. No, he's long dead. But his grandson, also known as Black William, as the Welsh detested him. He's around because Reginald de Braows, the son that inherited the Earl of Bramber in 1216, had died in 1228, meaning that Black William had only been the Earl months before being captured by the Welsh that year. And when the treaty is made up with the King of England, they offered up a ransom, £2,000. And William's daughter, Isabel, was set to marry Llywelyn's son, David. Maybe the tensions between the two families could be mended. Oh well, that would not be the case. Llywelyn was married to Joan, daughter of King John, King Henry's sister, apparently quite attractive. And guess what scallywag was giving her a portion of pork sword behind the scenes? Yep, Black William. Proper naughty. And he'd seemingly been caught red-handed. That's one way of putting it. Oh, that was pretty controversial, yes, to say the least. The marriage between the son and daughter can stay. This is between Isabella and Llywelyn's son, David. But Black William is swiftly arrested and taken back to Wales. There is nothing he nor anyone can do, and there would be no trial. So, in 1230, William de Braows is executed by the Welsh, hanged by the neck. And the de Braows estate first goes to his wife Eva, then is divided up between the 4 daughters. Right, that's done with. So I'll shift the focus back to Portsmouth, as there is another attempt for Henry's armies to muster for the invasion of the continent. The king must have felt nervous. Hubert de Burgh, meanwhile, had learnt his lesson. In April, the muster at Portsmouth was impressive. A lot of money had been raised for this. Numbers? There were 9 earls, 450 knights, backed up by around 4,000 men-at-arms, and there were hundreds of ships. And this wasn't all, as these forces would link up with the rebels on the continent that opposed the teenage king Louis of France and his mother Blanche of Castile. King Henry of England would retake the continent. He was convinced of it. Henry put Stephen Seagrave and Ralph Neville in charge, and the armada set off on the 30th of April, 1230, arriving at St Malo, Breton coast, 2 days later. This wasn't without problems though, as Henry's teenage sister, Eleanor, named after her grandmother, became seasick, causing Henry to divert 30 ships to the Isle of Jersey. She wasn't there as a random passenger, in case you're wondering. No, as she was married to the son of the legend, William Marshal, the 2nd Earl of Pembroke, one of the 9 aforementioned earls. Eleanor was also there for diplomacy. Henry still needed Hugh de Lusignan on his side, and Eleanor was his stepdaughter. Isabella of Angoulême was her mother. And Henry wagered Isabella of Angoulême wore the armoured trousers. So, once the girl was well again, the royal fleet set off, joining with Seagrave at St Malo. Henry probably had other thoughts in mind. This was the closest he had been to his mother since the coronation, over a decade ago. Both he and his sister, no doubt, were getting their hopes up. As for the invasion, the continent was already having aggression of its own. People were unhappy with Blanche of Castile here. They considered her a foreigner. Spain is neither France nor England. And Theobald, Count of Champagne, had mobilised on behalf of the Queen Regent. There were also rumours that she was shagging the papal legate, rumours that she was shagging the Count of Champagne. How many of her dozen children were legitimate? Hence, they were fighting with the Count of Champagne. Hence all the aggression. They did not like Blanche, and he was defending her. But Blanche needs this descent to end. She's caught wind of the English fleet. This squabble would have to be put aside. Defending their lands, defending the continent, is far more important than this silliness. Soon her forces had mustered in Anjou in anticipation of Henry, and Henry was prepared. Prepared for a lavish banquet as part of a welcoming party. He wasn't used to this, people submitting to him, indulging him, and no bickering and no backstabbing. He loved the fashions that were typical of French customs. He spoke French, but a different dialect than theirs. Even their food was prepared differently. More, he noticed the architecture. The continent had long embraced the Gothic style. It was the norm. The churches, the houses. The England had the Gothic architecture, but not on this scale. You've got York Cathedral, you've got Salisbury Cathedral. These were being built and there were others before it. But again, not on this scale. So Henry felt like a tourist, if anything, not an invader. Henry puts Hubert de Burgh in charge of affairs here. And after all, prior to defending Dover from the French on multiple occasions. During the reign of King John, he defended Chateau Gaillard in Chinon against the French, only surrendering upon learning John had no hope. De Burgh was the best choice. A solar eclipse is recorded on May the 14th. So solar eclipses are nothing unusual. There are about 2 of these a year, unless it's 1233 when 4 are recorded. This one seems to be recorded because it's unusually early in the morning, at least according to Wendover. Around 4 minutes to 5 in the morning, according to NASA. So, for some reason, this was important. Though do take in mind, Wendover and Matthew Paris and others who are recording these events, they're not working for NASA. They are medieval monks with a basic understanding of astronomy. They are not yet aware of bodies like Saturn or Jupiter. They would have no access to a telescope and would be relying on the naked eye. Yet you can ignore what happened in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. That's utter fiction. In fact, telescopes won't be around for centuries, by the early 17th century. So in the 13th century, you're buggered. Optical concepts like refraction and reflection are known, especially in the Arabic world. The theory's around. People know what to do. They are understanding the science of it. Unfortunately, the technology isn't around. Things like Roger Bacon's eyeglasses are not around yet. And even the great Ibn al-Haytham, an Islamic mathematician and astronomer, he had no access to any kind of visual aid that could study the stars beyond what the eye could see. And there you have it. Back to the invasion. The biggest problem Henry faces is Hubert de Burgh. Sure, he's a veteran who fought hard against the French, but he's no longer a young commander. He's around 60. He simply doesn't have the stomach for battle anymore, and his campaign in Wales was testament to that. So when around 60 Norman knights come to swear fealty to Henry. They expect the king to lead his forces into Normandy and liberate the continent. But de Burgh is overcautious and warns Henry against such a move. Confused and bewildered, the Normans then suggest that Henry hand them a part of the invasion force so they themselves can lead a charge. But de Burgh shuts down the debate. He refuses to hear any more about it and accuses the Normans of waging a private war and dismisses them. And Blanche? The second she hears the knights have betrayed her, she strips them of their titles. Traitors all. But it's not like de Burgh was devoid of tactics. He was just a battle-worn veteran, tired of conflict. He no doubt wanted to avoid a pitched battle. The strategy he suggested was to push into Nantes, right up close to the French. Let Blanche make the first move. Don't play into their hands. And time was on the side of the English, as, according to feudal law in France, the French knights only had to serve 40 days a year, and de Burgh wagered that once they had met this obligation, they'd quickly get back to fighting their preferred enemy, Theobald of Champagne. As for the English obligations, they're under feudal law as well. Well, de Burgh has brought over £5,000 to keep them paid. So yes, he may have no stomach for conflict, but he was certainly sound of mind. Henry agrees to this plan, and the army marches to Nantes, stopping just 50 miles from the French lines, waiting there encamped until the French military obligation runs out. And by July, the French simply disbanded and abandoned Blanche and her son Louis, leaving the English unopposed to march into Poitou. Now, I know what you're wondering, given the close proximity to his mother and stepfather, did Henry finally get to meet his mother after all these years? The answer was yes, they meet at Dinan, though it appears to be brief, and neither the king nor his sister Eleanor has managed to convince their parents to join this war effort to liberate the continent. At the Count of March, Hugh de Lusignan was firmly against it. All they could grant Henry and his sister was safe passage through Poitou. And that was it. Luckily for Henry, though, some of the local minor nobility had no such loyalty to the Count of March. Their loyalty was round and shiny, and, in Henry's eyes, they came cheap. Soon Henry led the English army along the Loire, facing resistance from the Mirabeau stronghold, which swiftly fell. And by August, the king was at Bordeaux, though this was more an effort to show his face, rather than an actual attempt to liberate Gascony. After all, he had already bought their loyalty with a massive, whopping great £50,000 bribe. So once Henry was satisfied that Gascony was loyal to England, and once he had enjoyed every banquet and every parade, he consolidated his forces back at Nantes. But all this pottering about and dithering wasn't of Henry's design, and the king feared Hubert might be putting the campaign in jeopardy. So he asked the Pope for a legate to get things moving. Unfortunately, it was already decreed, a while back, that no papal legates will interfere in England's business. And senior clergy put Henry under pressure until he withdrew the request. As 1230 dragged on, Henry decided to think bugger it and pretty much abandons the military campaign, committing himself to the act of tourist. It was not like he could progress any further with Hubert de Burgh, more intent to sit in meetings and cut deals than fight. So the king spends the campaign visiting shrines, cathedrals, enjoying his time on the continent. He even strolled the rocks of Armorica, casting his gaze over the Atlantic Ocean. The only trouble Henry felt, was when he caught dysentery, just like his father. But unlike his father, Henry wasn't an exhausted, middle-aged man on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He's a strapping young man in his 20s. This wasn't an illness that could keep him down for long. By September 1230, the squabbles between the warring factions between Blanche and her subjects were over, and most of the nobility who had sworn allegiance to Henry now switched to the King of France. Well, Blanche, you know what I mean. All aside from Peter of Dreux, the Duke of Brittany. Yes, but even that slimy scallywag merely asked Henry for higher paycheck, and Henry suggested the demand was met, and Peter was now £4,500 better off. What a pickle. But dysentery was spreading through the camp, affecting his brother Richard and other nobles. It was clear that the disastrous campaign was over. Henry puts Ranulph de Blondeville and William Marshal II in charge of salvaging something from this fiasco. Henry simply headed back to St Malo and hopped on a boat back to Blighty. He was in Portsmouth by late October. Henry must have felt gutted when he learnt to what happened next on the continent, as the French did attack in force, and all that stood to fight them was Ranulph de Blondeville and a fraction of the forces that remained. As the French moved in to drive the English out, Blondeville struck, destroying the French convoys, burning their siege engines, defiant to the last, leave nothing for the devil. 3 castles burned at the English onslaught. The French had no stomach for the fight. They had no obligation for this. They were disorganised, failing to make the English budge an inch, and they stayed there. Henry must have known that should he have ignored the advice of de Burgh, who was more intent to keep the king out of harm's way than put the fight to the French, should he have ignored this advice and slammed his forces into the French, that instead of feasting this Christmas in London, he would be feasting a celebratory banquet in Normandy. Merde! All this is hypothetical, and we have no way of knowing what the outcome would have been, or how long the success would have lasted. And Hubert de Burgh isn't totally to blame. He would have known the bureaucracy, the finances, and the military effort needed to keep the continent. With hindsight and the knowledge of the 21st century, we can forgive de Burgh for acting the way he did. He's old enough to remember Henry II, who died a broken man, fighting his sons as well as the French, or Richard Coeur de Lion, who fell to the French on a military campaign, followed by the infamous John, who died in a similar way to his father, broken, on the run, ill. Should Henry III fall in battle? The king was unmarried, and there were no heirs, no line of succession, and de Burgh didn't trust Richard of Cornwall with a silver spoon, let alone the crown. Even Henry falling ill with dysentery must have shaken poor old de Burgh to the core, whose one mission in his later years was to keep the throne out of French hands. This had most certainly been managed. There was also the reparations and land swaps required to keep the continent, as prior to all of this, in the reign of King John, many deals had been struck with the English who lost lands in Normandy and the Normans who lost lands in England. It was a very messy affair. All of this talk of land swaps and inheritance is probably what prompted the son of a famous French magnate to arrive at St James de Bouron, which is near Mont Saint Michel. He's a knight, and his father is none other than Simon de Montfort, hero of the Albigensian Crusade. We've heard of his name a few times during this series. This young man, only around the age of the king, arrogantly demands to see Ranulph de Blondeville, who currently resides in the castle. So Ranulph sits with this young man and discusses what the matter is. The knight explains that the earldom of Leicester is his by right, as his father Simon, who died in 1218, was the 5th Earl of Leicester. The title now belongs to his son, also Simon. Ranulph ponders this and takes the young knight under his wing until the army returned home to England in the next year. And Henry himself, sort of going back to what I was saying earlier, must have seen Hubert's point of view, as there would be no bad blood between them, and Christmas is indeed spent in London at Hubert de Burgh's manor in Lambeth, where there was quite a sombre atmosphere, as despite the lack of fighting, there had been a heavy amount of casualties during the Breton campaign to wrest the continent. A dysentery had claimed most. Even the Earl of Gloucester, Gilbert de Clare, the Earl was only 50, and the title passed down to his 8-year-old son, Richard, who was promptly placed in the care of Hubert de Burgh, for a fee. Other casualties of the conflict had been due to accidents or misadventure. One such accident was Hubert de Burgh's nephew, Raymond. He drowned when his horse stumbled while crossing the River Loire. Raymond was the chap who offended the wife of Longsby that time. Henry also sends letters to the King of France, Louis, letters relinquishing all claim to the continent. The matter was truly resolved. Everyone had a lot to reflect on as the new year began, and in January a council was called to discuss matters regarding finances for the campaign. Everyone had been taxed to the hilt, the magnates, the clergy, the Jews. Overall, they were looking for around 20 grand for the war effort. But it didn't clear the target. To break it down, the Jews raised just under 6,000. The magnates 7,000, woefully short. And the clergy initially refused to pay a single penny, and they needed a bit of persuasion. Right. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Richard Le Grand, argued that the church should not have to pay a penny for this war. And also, Richard Le Grand had joined the grumblers who opposed Hubert de Burgh's ever-increasing grip on the king. Where before the magnate had a friend and ally in the form of Stephen Langton, he now had only a political opponent. You see, Richard Le Grand was pulling up an old claim that was once raised by Thomas Becket, back in the days of Henry II, the claim to Tunbridge Castle. You see, the de Clares held the castle, but the king needed that church money, and you can see where Le Grand is going. The king tells him where to go in no uncertain terms. But while the old Le Grand ponders is if this is the king talking or de Burgh, because Richard de Clare is only 8 years old, and de Burgh has just become his guardian, and is pretty much hogging all the de Clare estates, including Tunbridge Castle. And it isn't de Clare's men who hold the garrison, it's de Burgh's men. So what would you do if you were the Archbishop of Canterbury and faced corruption like this? Here, Richard Le Grand excommunicated the whole bally lot of them, the entire garrison, then hopped on a ship and headed straight for Rome to complain about it. Oh yes, he was going to tell Pope Gregory that Hubert de Burgh has been a very naughty boy. Yeah, Archbishop Le Grand couldn't stand him. And Hubert de Burgh, the man who, if he hadn't already been married, would no doubt have married de Clare's widow just to get his hand on her lands and titles, as well as her son Richard. For Lady de Clare was none other than the daughter of the legendary William Marshal, and sister to the younger Marshal, who was fresh from the Breton campaign, which was now concluded. Though another ambitious chap would move in to sweep Isabel off her feet, the young and dashing Richard of Cornwall, brother to the king. He's round about 20, and she's 30. And King Henry certainly did not approve of this relationship. So when the two revealed their intent to marry, the king, of all people, was not invited. You cannot make this up. I get the brothers having a tiff, but it's the bloody king. It's not like he's sticking two fingers up to a guy down the pub, is it? The fact that Richard had the chutzpah to do this is a testament to his character. Regarding Henry, everyone was getting married by the king. He's 24, and every suitor had turned him down. If anything, Henry was better off going down the pub, and better chances. Anyway, Richard and Isabel were married on the 30th of March, 1231. Richard's brother wasn't there. Yes, he did in fact ban the king from the wedding. But Isabel's brother did attend, the heroic younger marshal, who enjoyed a feast like any man. But this time he drank too heavily and ate more than his fill. As in just a week, 7 days, he was found dead on the 6th of April. There are no records as to how he died, other than he just did. People concluded that he overindulged misadventure. Though this does not stop the accusations that Hubert de Burgh had William Marshal poisoned. An absurd claim, but this is the second accusation. Longsby, now William Marshal. And William had no children, so his brother Richard Marshal looked set to take the title as 3rd Earl of Pembroke. The problem is, Richard Marshal lives in Normandy. He's a vassal of the King of France. Hubert de Burgh is set against it, because after all, the French are the enemy. So that will have to be put off till another time. Besides, another Frenchman is also now at court, as de Blondeville introduces the young Simon de Montfort to the king, who does in fact grant the knight the earldom of Leicester. There you go. Elsewhere, Llywelyn the Great had taken the opportunity to rampage through Wales, intent on taking de Bros's lands, which, guess what, have made their way into the hands of de Burgh. What a co-winky-dink. And yeah, enough's enough. The king summons a small army and moves to meet the Welsh, who swiftly leave the lands alone. But no sooner did the English move away, the Welsh sneaked forward, intent on taking the lands. Yeah, only they found themselves captured by the forces of Hubert de Burgh. Kind of expected this kind of silliness. Now, de Burgh decides to send Llywelyn a message. Last year, when Llywelyn executed William de Bros, King Henry did nothing, which seems to have only emboldened the Welsh. But Hubert de Burgh isn't Henry III, and his stomach for war only softened in order to protect the king. Remember that riot in London 8 years ago? Remember how de Burgh dealt with the rioters? He had their hands and feet lopped off, a terrible punishment, barbaric even for the time. Here, he has the entire Welsh army, every captive, beheaded. No trial. Then the heads were sent to the king as trophies. Jesus Christ! This was brutal for the 10th century, let alone the 13th, and would have appalled the king. He's going Bronze Age on their arse. Llywelyn got the message, but his reaction wasn't what de Burgh was expecting. The Welsh warlord rose a great army and laid waste to de Bros's lands. He put them to ruin. Churches were burned with women and children inside, and villages were put to the torch. Such was his wrath. As I said, he was called the Great for a reason. He was a prince to be feared. And now Henry had no choice but to muster an army to deal with the Welsh. They mustered at Oxford, and then marched into Wales. But Llewellyn was cunning. He enlisted a monk to betray the king, and a part of the army was lured into a deadly ambush, where the English were slaughtered. It took the king 2 months to finally get things sorted, and the aptly named Payne's Castle fortress was rebuilt. And there was no winning against this powerful Welsh prince. Henry was more intent to stop him making any more incursions into his territory. Right. Oh. And by the way, you're never going to guess what happens in Italy. Come on, guess. If you had the Archbishop of Canterbury dies on your cards, then have a cookie. Or a shot, because you're going to need it. All was going well for Richard le Grand. He'd made such a strong case against Hubert de Burgh that when the magnate sent a proctor to argue the case, the Pope refused to hear it. Then, in good spirits, the Archbishop prepared to head back to England and fell ill. He died on the 3rd of August, 1231, leaving yet another empty chair in the See of Canterbury. We don't even know how old he was. And there wouldn't be a true Archbishop of Canterbury for another 9 years.